It was a busy afternoon at Los Angeles International Airport. Among the line of weary travelers was Linda Moore, a kind-hearted woman in her mid-40s, struggling with her carry-on and visibly nervous about the flight. She had always been self-conscious about her weight, and air travel was one of her biggest fears. As passengers boarded, the cabin was nearly full. Right in first class sat Keanu Reeves, quietly reading a book and keeping to himself, as usual. When Linda finally reached her seat, the trouble began. A flight attendant, visibly impatient, rolled her eyes and made a loud remark about people needing 2 seats. The comment drew snickers from a few nearby passengers. Linda froze, her face turning red. She tried to squeeze into her seat, mortified. Part 2. The public humiliation. As the aircraft doors closed, the tension grew. The flight attendant, Marcy, returned and continued making snide remarks under her breath about comfort and fitness. Some passengers looked away uncomfortably. Others pretended not to notice. Linda tried to hold back tears as she apologized repeatedly, though she had done nothing wrong. That's when Keanu Reeves quietly put down his book. He had been observing everything with quiet disapproval. Without drawing attention to himself, he got up from his seat and walked toward the aisle, his calm demeanor immediately commanding attention. Part 3. Keanu steps. Keanu stopped beside Linda's row. In his gentle, steady voice, he asked the flight attendant, "Is there a problem here?" Marcy stammered, trying to brush it off. "No, sir, just ensuring everyone is comfortable." Keanu nodded, then looked directly at Linda and said, "I think this lady deserves an apology." The cabin went silent. Marcy looked shocked and Linda was speechless. Keanu continued, "No one should be made to feel small for taking up space in the world." His words carried an unmistakable sincerity that silenced any remaining whispers. Part 4. The unthinkable gesture. Then came the unexpected. Keanu offered his first-class seat to Linda. "Please take my seat." "You deserve to travel comfortably," Linda protested, shaking her head, but Keanu insisted. "I'll be fine in economy." Without making a scene, he picked up his bag and moved to an empty seat in coach. The passengers broke into quiet applause, and even Marcy, now visibly ashamed, muttered an apology. Linda sat in disbelief, tears streaming down her face, not from embarrassment this time, but from gratitude and validation. Part 5. The aftermath. When the plane landed, Linda tried to thank Keanu again, but he simply smiled and said, "Just pass it on to someone else someday." Later, another passenger who had filmed part of the encounter shared it online. The story quickly went viral, praised not for celebrity drama but for simple human decency. Keanu never commented publicly about it, but for Linda, the experience was life-changing. For the first time in years, she felt seen, respected, and worthy. And for everyone who read the story, it was another reminder that kindness, when done quietly and sincerely, can still make the loudest noise. It was a typical afternoon at Los Angeles International Airport. The air was filled with the usual hustle and bustle. Travelers rushing to their gates, families dragging along oversized bags, and the constant overhead announcements reminding everyone to be mindful of their belongings. It was the kind of busy day that made the whole place feel overwhelming, like a maze of people and endless flights. Among the crowd, there was a woman trying to make her way through the terminal. She wasn't in a hurry, though. In fact, she seemed a little more cautious than most. She had a small carry-on bag, and every step she took was slow, deliberate. This was Linda, a woman in her early 40s, who had always loved traveling but felt a deep sense of discomfort in airports. Linda wasn't new to the stress of flying, but her anxiety had only grown over the years. She had always been a little heavier than most, and with each passing year, the weight seemed to feel heavier on her heart as well. Airports especially were places where she felt like people looked at her differently. The narrow seats, the stares, and sometimes even the comments that weren't meant for her ears, all of it made her feel like she didn't belong. Today was no different. She wasn't flying to some exciting vacation destination, but rather to visit a family member. Still, it was a trip she had been looking forward to, even though she had the nagging feeling that things might not go smoothly. The line at the gate was long. Linda found herself standing behind a young woman who kept turning to glance at her, eyes narrowing slightly, as if judging her for being too close in line. She did her best to ignore it, but it made her nervous. She tried to distract herself by looking at the flight attendants up ahead, hoping to find a familiar face, someone she could feel comfortable with. But when she looked up, she saw someone else, a flight attendant she hadn't noticed before, standing by the door, arms crossed, a sharp look on her face. Linda couldn't help but notice the way the attendant was glancing around the room, almost as if she were searching for something or someone to criticize. And when her eyes met Linda's, Linda quickly looked away. She could feel the judgment in her stare, the way it made her stomach tighten. When it was finally Linda's turn to board, she stepped forward, trying to keep her composure. But the moment she got close to the gate, she felt it. The flight attendant's eyes on her, narrowing just slightly as she moved in to check Linda's boarding pass. "You'll need to step aside for a moment," the attendant said, her voice cold. Linda blinked, a little surprised. She had traveled many times before and had never been asked to step aside like this. "I'm sorry," Linda replied, her voice a little shaky. "You're going to need to get checked in again. There's an issue with your seating arrangement." The flight attendant's tone was clipped as if Linda had done something wrong. Linda's heart began to race. She was taken aback. I don't understand," she stammered. "There's nothing wrong with my ticket, is there?" "Please wait right here," the flight attendant said before turning away to speak with another colleague. Linda stood there, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. She tried to ignore the whispers behind her, but it wasn't easy. The longer she stood there, the more she felt like she was under a microscope. She could feel the sting of judgment from some of the passengers, the whispers she couldn't quite catch but that were clearly about her. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, hoping that someone would say something, anything, to make her feel less invisible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the flight attendant returned. "There's nothing we can do about the seating," she said briskly. "You're going to need to take up 2 seats. Linda's face turned red with embarrassment. She had heard this before, but it didn't make it any easier. She could already feel the sting of everyone's eyes on her. I don't need 2 seats, she protested quietly. But the flight attendant was already walking away, not even sparing her a second glance. Linda could feel the anger rising in her chest, but more than that, she felt humiliated. She tried to hold back the tears, but the way the flight attendant had spoken to her, as if she were an inconvenience, was almost too much to bear. She had dealt with her weight all her life, but something about this situation made it feel like it was all anyone saw when they looked at her. As she shuffled toward her seat, trying to find the aisle, Linda couldn't help but overhear the murmurs from other passengers. A few had seen what happened, and their voices were hard to ignore. "That woman probably needs to lose a few pounds. Can't believe they gave her extra space. Unbelievable." Linda pressed her lips together, fighting back the tears. She wasn't sure if they were talking about her, but it didn't matter. The words stung just the same. She reached her seat and tried to squeeze into it. It wasn't the first time she had struggled with a tight airplane seat, but this time it felt worse. The seatbelt barely fit, and she could feel the eyes of the passengers around her. She did her best to hold her head high, even though her stomach churned with humiliation. That's when she heard it again. The flight attendant's voice, this time directed at her. "You're going to have to move over," the attendant said with a look of frustration. "You're spilling into the next seat." Linda blinked, shocked. She wasn't sure if she was imagining it or if the attendant was intentionally trying to embarrass her. But it felt cruel. She moved over as best as she could, but it didn't help much. It never did. She just wanted to disappear. The flight attendant sighed loudly, rolling her eyes. "I don't have time for this," she muttered under her breath, before walking off to handle the other passengers. Linda closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise of the plane filling up with people. She just wanted to get through this flight without making a scene. She didn't want to cause trouble. She just wanted to be left alone. But little did she know someone was paying attention. A man sitting in the first-class section had been quietly observing everything. He had noticed the flight attendant's treatment of Linda, the way she was treated like an inconvenience. He wasn't sure what was happening, but there was something about the situation that didn't sit right with him. That man was Keanu Reeves. Linda tried to ignore the discomfort that had settled in her chest as the plane started to taxi down the runway. She wanted to close her eyes to pretend like none of it had happened, but it was impossible. The weight of the embarrassment was heavy, and it lingered in the pit of her stomach. She could still feel the flight attendant's cold stare, and the murmurs of the other passengers. It felt like everyone on the plane was watching her, judging her every move. She looked out the window, watching the ground get smaller beneath them. The city she had just left behind felt so far away now, and yet she felt closer to a breaking point than ever before. There was a lump in her throat, but she tried to swallow it down. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to be that woman, the one who couldn't handle something as simple as a flight. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to find a position that didn't feel too tight, but it was no use. The seatbelt felt like it was digging into her, and the armrests pressed against her sides. She closed her eyes and told herself to breathe. Just breathe. The flight attendant walked by again, this time with a different look in her eyes. She looked down at Linda with a judgmental glance before continuing her walk up the aisle. It was almost as if she couldn't bear to look at Linda for more than a second. Linda felt the sting of that glance like a slap, but there was something more happening now. Something that Linda wasn't aware of. As the plane rose into the air, a man sitting in the first-class section had been watching all of this. Keanu Reeves had always been someone who observed people with a quiet intensity. It was one of the reasons he had become such a beloved actor. His ability to read a room, to understand the emotions behind the actions of those around him. But today he wasn't thinking about acting or making movies. He was just another passenger on a plane like everyone else. However, something had caught his attention. When the flight attendant had spoken to the woman in the row just ahead of him, there was something in the way she had treated her that didn't sit right. It wasn't just the words she used. It was the tone, the way she seemed to look at the woman like she was a problem. Keanu didn't know exactly what was happening, but he could tell that this woman, Linda, was being humiliated in a way that felt unjust. It was subtle, but it was there. He had seen moments like this before. Small, cruel acts of kindness lost or forgotten in a world that was often too busy or too self-absorbed to notice. But today, in this small moment, Keanu decided he wouldn't stay silent. As the plane leveled out and the seatbelt sign turned off, Keanu sat back in his seat, feeling the quiet hum of the engine beneath him. He had just started to return to his book when he heard the faint sound of whispers from the row behind him. He turned his head slightly and saw the woman, Linda, looking down at her lap, clearly uncomfortable. The other passengers were stealing glances at her, and the tension in the air was palpable. It was at that moment that he made a decision. Without thinking much about it, Keanu stood up, sliding his bag off the seat beside him. The action wasn't loud or dramatic, but it did draw the attention of a few people around him. They watched as he walked down the aisle, his pace slow and deliberate. As he approached Linda's row, he caught sight of the flight attendant again. She was busy with something else, looking in the other direction. He made his way down the aisle, stopping just beside Linda's seat. She looked up at him in surprise, unsure of what was happening. "Excuse me," Keanu said, his voice calm but firm. "Is everything okay here?" Linda blinked, not sure if she had heard him correctly. The flight attendant had just passed by and had barely even acknowledged her. She opened her mouth, about to say something, but then the words caught in her throat. Keanu noticed her hesitation, and instead of waiting for her to respond, he turned his attention to the flight attendant who had walked up the aisle earlier. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Keanu said, his voice quieter now but still carrying that calm, assured tone. "I don't believe anyone should be treated this way." The flight attendant froze in her tracks, her eyes widening slightly as she looked at Keanu. It was clear that she hadn't expected anyone to say anything. But what was even more surprising was the fact that it was him, Keanu Reeves, the actor, the man who was known for his roles in action-packed films, who was speaking up. "Sir, I'm just doing my job," she replied, trying to regain her composure. "There are rules about seating arrangements." Keanu shook his head gently, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I understand," he said, "but rules don't justify treating someone like they don't matter." The flight attendant didn't know how to respond. She seemed taken aback by the gentleness in his voice, but also by the weight of his words. Linda had been watching this exchange with wide eyes. She couldn't believe what was happening. Was Keanu Reeves really standing there, talking to the flight attendant on her behalf? She wanted to say something, to thank him, but words seemed to fail her. She just sat there frozen as the scene unfolded before her. Keanu turned back to Linda, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Linda nodded, though her eyes were filled with tears. She hadn't expected anyone to come to her defense today. She had become so used to being invisible in moments like this, to being ignored or dismissed because of her weight. But here was someone famous, someone with power in this situation actually caring. It made her heart ache. "I'm fine," she whispered, though the words didn't feel true. Keanu smiled and gave her a small nod before turning back to the flight attendant. "I'd like to offer my seat to this lady," he said, his voice clear now like he was making a simple request. The flight attendant's eyes went wide with shock. "You can't," she started to protest, but Keanu raised his hand, stopping her. "Please," and he said, "It's the least I can do." There was a brief moment of silence before the flight attendant finally backed down. She muttered something under her breath and walked away, still visibly frustrated. Keanu turned back to Linda, who was still sitting in stunned silence. "Would you like to take my seat in first class?" he asked, his tone as easygoing as if he were offering a seat on a bus. Linda's mouth opened and closed as if she couldn't quite process what was happening. I couldn't possibly," she began, but Keanu simply smiled and nodded toward the empty seat next to him. "Trust me," he said, "I'll be perfectly fine in economy." Linda didn't know what to say. The words wouldn't come out. Instead, she stood up slowly, her hands shaking as she moved toward the empty first-class seat. She was still in disbelief. She never thought something like this would happen. And yet, in that moment, Linda felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: dignity. As she settled into the first-class seat, Linda took a deep breath, letting the calm of the moment wash over her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel ashamed of who she was. For the first time, she felt like someone saw her for the person she was, not just for her weight. Meanwhile, Keanu had made his way to an empty seat in the back of the plane, smiling quietly to himself. He wasn't looking for praise, nor did he need it. He simply wanted to do the right thing, and for Linda, this small act of kindness would stay with her long after the flight had ended. The flight continued in relative peace. Linda, now seated comfortably in the first-class section, had found a moment of quiet amid the chaos that had unfolded just moments earlier. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, still unsure of what had just happened. She kept looking out the window, the clouds outside so white and fluffy, but inside her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She couldn't stop thinking about what Keanu had done. Offering her his seat had been such an unexpected, generous gesture. It wasn't just about the seat, though. It was the kindness he had shown in standing up for her, a total stranger in a moment where she had felt so small, so invisible. And it wasn't just his actions that had made an impact. It was the way he had spoken to the flight attendant, as if to say, "This isn't right. This person deserves respect." Linda thought back to the way the attendant had spoken to her earlier, how it had felt like she was being sized up, judged, and rejected. She couldn't help but feel that her weight had been a reason for that treatment, even if no one had explicitly said it. People often found ways to make her feel lesser than they were, like she didn't belong in certain spaces because of how she looked. Today, she had been reminded of how easy it was for people to forget that everyone deserved kindness no matter what. But Keanu hadn't forgotten. It made her wonder, how could someone so famous, someone who didn't have to care, be so grounded, so aware of others around him? And why had he chosen to help her? Why her? The more Linda thought about it, the more she realized how often she had been overlooked. It wasn't just on airplanes. It was everywhere. In stores, in restaurants, at work. It was like she had become invisible to the world, and no one seemed to care enough to stop and notice. It was easier to pretend she wasn't there. She could blend into the background, go unnoticed. But that didn't make her feel good. It made her feel alone. But today was different. As the plane cruised through the sky, Linda allowed herself to breathe deeply, her chest rising and falling slowly. She could hear the soft hum of the engine in the background, the occasional chatter of passengers, and the click of the seatbelt sign turning off. It felt like a moment of peace after so much tension. She sat up straighter, trying to release the tightness in her shoulders. She hadn't realized how tense she had been until now. A flight attendant came by to check on the passengers. She walked past Linda's row, smiling politely. But Linda couldn't help but notice that this attendant didn't have the same sharpness that the other one had. This woman's demeanor was much warmer. She paused when she saw Linda sitting in the first-class seat, clearly surprised. "I see we have a new seat arrangement," the attendant said with a friendly tone. "Are you doing okay? Can I get you anything?" Linda smiled, still processing the surreal feeling of being treated with care. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied softly, her voice tinged with the quiet gratitude she was still trying to fully express. The attendant nodded and moved on, but Linda couldn't help but wonder, what would have happened if Keanu hadn't intervened? What would the flight have been like for her? She had imagined many scenarios, most of them unpleasant. She had assumed that she would spend the entire flight feeling like a burden, trying not to take up too much space, trying to blend into the seat and become invisible. But now, in this moment, it felt like she could finally let go of that heavy weight, the weight of constantly trying to shrink herself for the comfort of others. While Linda settled into her seat, Keanu remained quietly in the back of the plane in economy class. He had made the choice to sit in a regular seat, despite having a perfectly comfortable one available in first class. He wasn't bothered by the decision. He was used to it. The truth was, Keanu had always tried to live his life in a way that was grounded and humble. His fame didn't make him different from anyone else. He didn't want to be treated as some sort of special figure, as though his worth was tied to his celebrity status. He had watched the flight attendant walk away from Linda's row, and for a brief moment, he had wondered if he had done the right thing. But the way Linda had looked at him, there had been something in her eyes that made him sure he had made the right choice. It wasn't about a gesture of kindness to make himself feel good. It was about doing something to show that there was still goodness in the world. That, despite the negativity people often faced, there were still those who would stand up and say, "This isn't okay." Keanu sat back in his seat, lost in his thoughts for a moment. He wasn't looking for recognition. He didn't need applause or thanks. It was simply how he had been raised, to help when you could, to lift others up when they needed it. And today he had seen someone who needed a lift, someone who had been knocked down by the world. As the hours passed, Linda began to feel more at ease. The initial shock of Keanu's gesture had started to fade, and with it came a sense of gratitude that she had never experienced before. She realized that the simple act of kindness had restored her faith in humanity, something she hadn't even realized she had lost until it had been given back to her. Her thoughts drifted back to her childhood, to the times when she had felt different from the other kids. She had always been the bigger girl, the one who didn't quite fit in with the others. Even as a child, she could remember the stares, the teasing, and the feeling of being left out. It wasn't something that went away as she grew older. In fact, it seemed like the world just found more ways to remind her of it. Linda's parents had always been supportive, but even they couldn't shield her from the world's judgment. The cruel comments from classmates, the sideways glances in restaurants, the whispered remarks when she walked into a store. It was like it was impossible to escape. And as she grew older, it started to wear on her. But here, in this moment, sitting in the first-class seat of a plane, Linda felt something shift. It wasn't just the luxury of the seat that made her feel different. It was the realization that for once she wasn't being judged. For once, someone had seen her as more than just the size of her body. She was a person, someone deserving of respect, of kindness. When the flight finally began to descend toward its destination, Linda's thoughts were still on what had happened. She looked out the window again, watching as the ground below began to take shape. She could feel the plane start to dip, the wheels descending, but she felt no fear. There was a quiet peace within her that hadn't been there before. The plane touched down smoothly, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their arrival. Linda had to blink a few times to clear her thoughts as the noise in the cabin began to rise with the movement of passengers gathering their things. But all she could think about was how, for the first time in a long time, she felt seen. The days that followed felt different for Linda. The routine of her life had returned, but something inside her had shifted. She woke up each morning with a little more confidence, with a new sense of possibility. The small act of kindness she had received from a stranger, Keanu, had sparked a change, one that had made her see herself in a new light. She was used to feeling like she had to keep her head down, to try to blend in with the crowd, to avoid drawing attention to herself. She had spent so many years thinking that if she just made herself smaller, made herself less visible, she could avoid the judgment, the whispers, the stares. But now, after everything that had happened, Linda had begun to believe something different. She didn't have to hide. She didn't have to shrink. For the first time in a long time, She felt like she could take up space in the world, without apology. A week had passed since the flight, and Linda's life was still moving forward. She had visited her family, spent time with old friends, and enjoyed the sense of freedom that came with not worrying so much about what others thought. But despite all of that, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. There was something about her encounter with Keanu that she couldn't let go of, something that lingered in the back of her mind, urging her to take action. One afternoon, while sitting at a small cafe near her home, Linda found herself thinking about what she wanted from life. She had always been hesitant to pursue her dreams, to go after what she truly wanted. She had often told herself that she didn't deserve it, that her size and appearance would hold her back. But now, looking back on everything that had happened, the kindness she had been shown, the strength she had found in herself, she knew she had to do something more. It wasn't about waiting for someone else to validate her. It wasn't about trying to fit into a mold that the world had set for her. It was about choosing to live for herself, to embrace who she was, and to move forward with courage. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced down to see a message from a friend she hadn't spoken to in a while. "Hey, are you still interested in doing that fitness challenge? I know we've talked about it before, and I thought now might be a good time to start." Linda smiled to herself. She had always wanted to get more active, to focus on her health, but the idea of a fitness challenge had seemed too daunting, too overwhelming. But now, after everything she had experienced, the idea didn't seem so impossible. She had spent too long letting her fears control her. Now she wanted to take back that control. She typed a quick reply. "I'm in. Let's do it." It wasn't about losing weight or changing her body to fit some ideal. It was about proving to herself that she could take charge of her life, that she was strong enough to push through her doubts and take on new challenges. She was doing it for herself, not for anyone else. As the days passed, Linda found herself gradually making changes. She started walking every day, taking small steps toward a healthier lifestyle. She didn't push herself too hard. She knew that real change took time, and she didn't want to overwhelm herself. But each day she felt a little stronger, a little more empowered. She found joy in the process, in the simple act of taking care of her body. And as she did, she felt a renewed sense of confidence, as though she were finally reconnecting with the person she had always been, underneath the fear and insecurities. One afternoon, while she was out on her walk, her phone rang. It was a call she had been expecting, but when she saw the number, her heart skipped a beat. It was from the company where she had applied for a job months ago, a job she had almost forgotten about in the midst of everything else. "Hello, is this Linda?" a friendly voice asked. "Yes, this is Linda," she replied, her heart racing. "I'm calling to let you know that we'd like to offer you the position. We were really impressed with your interview, and we believe you'd be a great fit for the role." Linda could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had applied for the job out of a sense of hope, but she hadn't expected to actually get it. The offer felt like a confirmation that everything she had been working toward, the small changes, the shift in mindset, had been worth it. It was a reminder that her dreams were within reach, that she was capable of achieving what she set out to do. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking slightly with excitement. "I'm thrilled. I would love to accept the offer." She hung up the phone, her hands trembling. It wasn't just the job that had her heart racing. It was the realization that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. She had spent so long doubting herself, telling herself that she wasn't worthy of good things, but now she had proven herself wrong. She was worthy. Over the next few weeks, Linda dove headfirst into her new job. The work was challenging, but she found herself rising to the occasion. She wasn't intimidated by the responsibilities. Instead, she embraced them. She had learned to trust herself, to believe in her abilities, and it made all the difference. She no longer saw herself as someone who needed to hide or shrink away. She was someone who was ready to step into the world with confidence, knowing that she had the strength to handle whatever came her way. As the months went by, Linda continued to grow. She stayed active. She continued to pursue her dreams, and she surrounded herself with people who supported her. She no longer felt like she had to apologize for who she was. She didn't need validation from anyone else to know that she was enough. And then one day she found herself in a familiar situation. She was on a flight again, this time on her way to a business trip. As she walked down the aisle, She noticed that the flight attendants were busy preparing for takeoff, but one of them caught her eye. The woman was smiling, but there was something familiar about her face. Linda paused for a moment, trying to place her, and then it clicked. The flight attendant was the same one who had been working on the plane months ago, the one who had treated her with kindness. She smiled, and the attendant smiled back. There was no need for words. Linda knew that their paths had crossed for a reason. It was a reminder that kindness had a ripple effect, that it spread from person to person, and that the good we put into the world often comes back in unexpected ways. As Linda sat down in her seat and prepared for the flight, she felt a quiet sense of peace. She had come so far since that day on the plane, and she was proud of the woman she had become. She had faced her fears, challenged her doubts, and stepped into her own power, and most importantly, she had learned to be kind to herself. The journey wasn't over, but Linda knew one thing for sure. She was no longer afraid to take up space in the world. She was no longer afraid to be herself. And that was the most powerful change of all. Months had passed since Linda's life had taken that unexpected turn, and each day seemed to bring new experiences, new lessons, and new growth. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when she still wrestled with the remnants of her insecurities. But overall, Linda felt different, more confident, more sure of herself, more ready to take on the world. Her job had been going well, and she had continued to work hard and prove herself. Her co-workers had come to respect her, not just for her work ethic, but for the quiet strength she exuded. Linda had become a steady presence in the office, someone people could count on. And while she was still new to this level of professional success, she had begun to see herself as capable, deserving of the opportunities that were coming her way. Outside of work, her fitness journey had continued. It wasn't about achieving any specific goal or trying to fit into some societal standard of beauty. It was about feeling strong, healthy, and proud of herself. Linda had found a rhythm, a balance, and it gave her a sense of accomplishment that extended beyond physical changes. She was doing this for herself, for the simple joy of movement and self-care. It felt empowering to know that her body was capable of more than she had ever realized. And then one afternoon, her phone rang. The caller ID read, "Unknown," and she almost didn't pick it up. But something told her to answer. "Hello?" she said, a little hesitant. "Hi, is this Linda?" The voice on the other end was calm, friendly. "Yeah, this is she. This is Keanu," the voice said. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Linda's heart skipped a beat. It took her a moment to process what she was hearing. Keanu, the same Keanu who had changed everything for her on that plane months ago. The same Keanu who had shown her that kindness still existed in the world when she needed it most. "No, you're not disturbing me at all," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel her excitement bubbling up inside her. "How are you?" "I'm doing well," he replied. "I've been thinking about our conversation since that flight, and I wanted to reach out to see how you've been doing." "How's everything going?" Linda felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't sure what to say at first. How could she possibly explain what those few moments on the plane had meant to her? How could she express how much of an impact his kindness had made? "It's been a lot of changes," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, but in a good way. "I've been working on myself, on my confidence, on my health. A lot of things feel different now. I feel different." "That's amazing to hear," Keanu said, his tone warm and genuine. "I'm glad to know that the little bit I could do had some kind of positive effect." "You deserve to feel good about yourself." Linda smiled to herself. She had never expected a phone call like this. It was one thing for someone to do something kind in the moment, but for Keanu to actually take the time to follow up, it was beyond anything she had imagined. "Well, thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I really appreciate it. You have no idea how much it meant to me." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and then Keanu spoke again. "I was wondering if you'd be open to meeting sometime. If you're not too busy, I'd love to get to know you better. Talk more about what you've been up to." Linda blinked, surprised. She hadn't expected this at all. It wasn't about the fame or celebrity status, but the fact that Keanu had reached out to her for no reason other than to connect, to continue the kindness he had shown her before. "I'd love that," she replied, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "When works for you?" They made plans to meet the following weekend at a cafe that Linda enjoyed. She wasn't sure what to expect from this meeting, but she felt an overwhelming sense of calm, It wasn't about impressing anyone or trying to live up to expectations. It was simply about two people connecting on a human level, sharing stories, and seeing where the conversation went. As the days leading up to the meeting passed, Linda felt a growing sense of excitement mixed with nerves. She kept telling herself to stay grounded, to not let the fact that Keanu was famous overwhelm her. After all, he was just a person, a kind person, someone who had helped her when she needed it most. Saturday arrived and Linda made her way to the cafe, wearing something simple but comfortable. She didn't want to overthink it or put pressure on herself to look a certain way. She wanted to be herself, the woman who had learned to embrace who she was, flaws and all. When she arrived, she spotted Keanu sitting at a table near the window. He stood up when he saw her and greeted her with a warm smile. His presence was calm and grounded, and he didn't seem to carry the weight of celebrity like she had imagined. In fact, he seemed more like someone you'd find having coffee with a friend, not a Hollywood star. "Hey, it's great to see you again," Keanu said as he motioned for her to sit down. "How's everything?" Linda smiled, feeling more at ease. "It's been good. Really good, actually. Life has been different in the best way possible. I feel like I'm actually living now instead of just going through the motions." "That's awesome to hear," Keanu said. "I think we all go through those moments where we don't realize how much we're holding ourselves back until something or someone gives us the push we need." Linda nodded, her mind drifting back to the plane ride, to that moment when everything had changed. "You were that push for me. I honestly don't think I would have made the changes I have without that moment on the plane." Keanu smiled, looking genuinely touched by her words. "I'm glad I could help. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us that we're worthy. You know, I think I've spent so much time doubting myself, hiding who I am, that I didn't realize I was waiting for permission to just be myself," Linda admitted. "But now I'm starting to see that I don't need anyone's permission to be me." "That's the key," Keanu said with a nod. "The world can be harsh, but the only opinion that matters is your own. When you learn to stand in your own truth, everything else falls into place." They spent the next few hours talking, laughing, and sharing stories. Linda found herself opening up more than she had expected, feeling a connection that went beyond the surface. Keanu didn't treat her any differently because of her size, her appearance, or her past. He simply saw her for who she was, a strong, capable woman who had the potential to do amazing things. As they parted ways that afternoon, Linda felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known before. She had always worried about how others saw her, about whether she was enough, but now she understood that the most important thing was how she saw herself. The meeting with Keanu had reminded her that kindness, connection, and self-acceptance were more important than anything else. And as she walked away from the cafe, Linda felt like she was finally walking into the life she had always dreamed of, a life where she was enough, just as she was.